Good afternoon, everyone. It is truly a pleasure to be part of this webinar entitled Where Feed Technology and Animal Nutrition Meets. And today I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Kelly Wamsley, who I admire a lot because she is an excellent researcher, excellent teacher, and a mentor of the future leaders of the poultry industry. Dr. Wamsley is from West Virginia, and she received her academic training under the direction of Dr. John Moritz at West Virginia University. In September 2012, Dr. Wamsley joined the Department of Poultry Science at Mississippi State University as an assistant professor of poultry nutrition. And then she was promoted to associate professor in July 2019. And Dr. Wamsley has a 40% teaching appointment and a 60% research appointment. And she's going to share a little bit more about the program. Something very important to mention is that Dr. Wamsley has mentored 10 international visiting scholars. She has graduated 4 PhDs and 9 master students. And she is currently mentoring 2 PhD students, 3 master students, and 10 undergraduates. And she has been invited to give talks, some, in the US, but also internationally. And she has published 49 peer-reviewed journal articles. So I would like to invite everyone online to ask your questions for Dr. Wamsley. I'm going to read them at the end of her presentation. And again, it is a pleasure. And Dr. Wamsley, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Wilmer, and thank you guys for joining us today. It's an honor to be here and be invited to give this presentation. Although I will say it's a very broad and kind of daunting topic, but also a very important topic. And so I kind of took a stab at it to come from a couple different angles. And I'm sure that this would be a great topic to have several renditions of or editions to kind of build upon. But I'm excited to be in the first start of it all. So thank you for joining. So as Wilmer has already kind of given a little bit of background, I'm from West Virginia originally, and all of my education was from West Virginia University under the direction of Dr. Joe Moritz. And he gave me a lot of opportunities getting involved in undergraduate research really early on, which really sparked my interest on poultry, and then just research in general in nutrition and how it can impact feed manufacture variables, and how feed manufacture can also influence the nutrition and ultimately the bird. And so, I'm a broiler nutritionist, and so that's kind of the take that I'm going to have on things today. And then I came to Mississippi State and Department of Poultry Science, and I've been there for going on 11 years now. And time flies when you're having fun. I have a great department and a great group of people around me, fantastic students and facilities, and then, of course, a great industry. And so really excited to share with you some of the stuff that we do. So I have a research and teaching appointment, and within my research appointment, we do a lot of feed quality work. We also look at various diet formulation strategies, manipulating digestible amino acids, and looking at amino acid density and optimal energy density to optimize performance, and then also considering the economics behind that, and evaluating various feed additives from enzymes to also antibiotic alternative type products. And we collaborate with USDA, and I think that our lab group does a lot of really practical research. So we're working directly with integrators and trying to solve the problems that they may have. And we have some basic research that we do within the lab, and we've gotten some cecectomized roosters within our lab in the past, and working on doing that again. And we've done some amino acid requirement work with various strains. For teaching, I teach a course in feed manufacture, and I take kind of a nutritional approach to it also when I'm teaching my students. And then also teach a course in poultry evaluation, rotationally teach undergraduate seminar. I help with the New Zealand Study Abroad project and guest lecture in a lot of courses. I co-advise the Poultry Science Club, and I'm graduate coordinator, and also I teach a graduate seminar in our department. And so some of the pictures down below are just kind of showing some of my lab, various pictures from judging, some research projects, field trips, of course, and then also some field work that we've done working with integrators in general. And of course, as I mentioned, I've got a lot of students. This is a subsection of my lab. This was actually taken about a month ago. We went to Poultry Science and the annual meeting in Philadelphia. And along the way, we went caving as a bonding trip. And so there's a picture of us and then a picture of everyone dressed up and after sharing a lot of great presentations. So what we're looking at, right? We're looking at maximizing growth potential through feed. And what's in the feed, right? Different ingredients. And they're providing nutrients to the bird to ultimately optimize performance. So why are those ingredients important and what are they going to do? They're providing good nutrition, hopefully, right? And nutrition ultimately, it's the science of providing the proper amounts of different nutrients and the balance of them. And we know that we can't just simply throw those ingredients together. They must be properly mixed and balanced for nutrients. And that's ultimately to get the maximum return on feed costs to optimize our production outputs. And so thinking about different birds, you know, from broilers and turkeys, we're looking at muscle accretion and growth, layers, broiler breeders, more of that egg production. Broiler breeders also some muscle accretion and growth, but also egg production and fertility, right? But simply put, the feed is going to contain water. It's going to contain energy to fuel life processes, nutrients, right, which are energy, right, but building blocks of tissue, and then also some non-nutritive additives, just depending on production style. So there may be some medications involved, or some probiotics or gut health type products, as well as enzymes or even pigments. Why is nutrition important? Obviously, we said it's, you know, to help with all life processes, right? But ultimately, when it comes down to it, feed is the single greatest expense in any animal operation. And so it's important just because of the money, right? It's 2/3 of all the production costs that go into raising that bird, and that those are accounted through feed costs. And so again, all we're looking at is just trying to make sure that we're providing a balanced diet and that we're not doing, you know, the bird any, giving the bird any kind of deficiencies in nutrients or any kind of excess. And we want to achieve maximum productivity. And that can look like a lot of things. Again, just growth, livability, reproductive fitness, or production, just depending on the goal. And so how do we meet these balanced diet conditions? So we do it through the feed, and that's going to be various feed ingredients. And this is a very, very simplified list of ingredients that could be included into a common diet. But, you know, so here we've got corn, soybean meal, you know, limestone, rock phosphate group, salt, various crystalline amino acids, energy source supplemental as an animal fat or poultry fat, or soybean oil. And, you know, there could be, and then of course, vitamin mineral premixes, enzymes, any type of gut health products, and then a number of byproducts that are commonly used, right? And so again, you know, looking at this list, it looks pretty simple, just a lot of various ingredients, but pretty common list, right? But you have to take into account that various ingredients contain different nutrient types and percentages, and they have different qualities or bioavailabilities of the nutrients. And so if we just take yellow dent corn, and forgive me, this may not be as relatable to what's out there right now, but in general, it's gonna, it's ultimately gonna contain the 6 different nutrients: water, carbohydrate, protein, lipids, minerals, and vitamins. But they're going to have various breakdowns of what percentages that are going to be provided. And so we're taking all of those different nutrients and trying to balance all of them from each ingredient, right? And ultimately going to supply the bird with a complete nutritionally balanced diet with every peck and every serving. And so a part of that is, the nutritionist is going to formulate the diet, but then the feed has to be manufactured. And so feed manufacturing, you're going to take a variety of raw ingredients that are going to range in physical, chemical, and nutritional compositions. And they're going to be put in this homogeneous mixture that's going to be uniform and going to provide that desired nutritional response. And so, of course, the order of feed manufacture. So you're going to have the formulation is going to be received by the feed mill, but then you're going to be receiving and storing ingredients, grinding some ingredients. In most commercial operations, it could be grinding corn. Then you're going to be batching and mixing, and so that's going to require various types of scales and ways to move product and then mix the product thoroughly. And then the pelleting process, and then finally the finished feed load out, and then delivery to a poultry house, and that's going to be augured, where the feed's going to be augured from a bin throughout the house to reach the bird. And so within that, to make sure that the bird is going to get every peck, we have some additional costs that we impart upon that feed. And so we pellet the feed, and I'll go into that in just a moment also. But the whole goal behind that is that we're supplying the bird again with a nutritionally balanced serving with each peck. But this is going to be a much more comprehensive or dense providing of those nutrients. And as you can see, there are a variety of ingredients, and we talked about them having different qualities, sizes, and densities. And so those can segregate in a mash feed. And so if we can combine it into a larger particle size, then we're going to impart better nutrition. And so when we're talking about receiving, you may think, okay, so how does this relate to nutrition? But, there are a lot of things that within receiving at a feed mill that can impact at every step of the way the nutrition of the feed. And so it's not just making sure that that feed is formulated correctly, it's making sure that it's executed correctly throughout the whole process. And so this is the first line of defense for a feed mill to get quality feed made in the receiving process. And when we're looking at grinding, and I discussed that grinding corn is probably the most common manufacturing process that's going to occur if you're grinding. You can do that from a feed manufacturer and a nutritional perspective. And so there's a lot of data that's especially from a nutritional perspective, but in general, reducing that corn particle size, at least from the whole corn kernel, then you're going to increase the surface area, and you're going to, that then will allow for increased digestive enzyme access and absorption. Now, where it gets a little less clear is the actual micron size to agree upon. You think about, from a feed manufacturer standpoint, that the larger feed particle size that you have, then when you're making that pellet, that could be a fracture point within that pellet. And so from a feed manufacturer standpoint, you may not want to go as larger than what you may want to from a nutritional perspective. But there's a lot of data out there in regard to gut health. A little less data, but Dr. Pacheco's done some of it on particle size with corn and feed quality. And so I just wanted to highlight the fact that there are a lot of things to consider when thinking about grinding, plus the electrical energy usage that it requires. And so then mixing, right? We're going to obtain a uniform mixture, and we're having different solid and liquid ingredients that we're going to mix together, and we want to do it without nutrient destruction, and we want to do it in the least amount of time possible, and make sure that the nutrients that the nutrition is formulated for are going to be there in the feed. Then thinking about from a conditioning and pelleting standpoint, this is a very, very simple CPM 40 horsepower pellet mill, but you're going to take that mixed feed, right? And that's going to go in a surge bin above the pellet mill. And it's going to be augered down, and it's going to be conditioned in the conditioning chamber. In that conditioning chamber, it's going to be exposed to saturated steam. And so this is going to be one point where you're going to be thinking about temperature. You're trying to manipulate, create this agglomeration of small particles, and almost like Play-Doh magic. You're taking this, all of you're changing the form of the feed and making it very pliable. And then it's going to be extruded through the die and frictional heat. And so then to create that pellet. And so, die thickness can change. There are different parameters that are associated with this pellet mill die, the pellet die. And then also within the steam system, the conditioning length and pick angles, and then how high you're conditioning your feed, that can ultimately impact this final product. And one thing that really is going on in the conditioning chamber that are being initiated, two reactions are starch gelatinization and protein denaturation or gelation. And proper conditioning is going to increase those reactions. So for starch gelatinization, if you take a typical broiler diet, starch is going to represent 60 to 70% of an inclusion in the broiler diet. And that's going to, and when we're looking at the different types of starch that are going to be included in the diet, there are going to be two main structural polysaccharides. We're looking at amylose and amylopectin. And this is going to play a role in that particle agglomeration and pellet formation and helping with that feed to stick together. Although there are some caveats to that. But in general, what you're seeing, and this is just a pure cornstarch molecule, and what you're doing in the conditioning chamber is you are exposing that starch to heat and excess moisture. And the key there is that excess moisture. In traditional feed pelleting or feed manufacture, the moisture is going to be your rate limiting step in how much starch is actually gelatinized. But what you can see in that process is that starch molecule starts to imbibe water and then gets a little more fluidy and starts to gel, like in that picture on the bottom right part of the screen. And that has, the cornstarch shows the different temperatures there. And but what's important to note is that various ingredients, their starch components are going to vary, and the starch itself is going to look different. And with that, it's also going to have different gelatinization properties. So different amounts of water and heat that's going to need to be applied to have starch gelatinization to occur. So again, the other reaction that we're looking at is protein denaturation and gelation. And protein is going to be representing 18 to 20% of the broiler diets. So soybean meal is going to be the primary protein source in the US. And it is costly, but everything now especially is costly, right? It's been said to have the biggest impact on pellet formation and quality. But one thing that you have to be cautious about is that just increasing your protein in your feed is not just going to ultimately give you a better pellet quality. The type of protein also matters. And I have a slide about that in just a moment. But there's been research that's shown that just improving a little bit more soybean meal into the diet, or providing other sources of protein, like in trout protein paste, that it can improve feed quality. And so what's happening in this process is the heating of that feed or that ingredient is going to cause proteins to unfold from their natural form. They're going to denature, and then they're going to form new bonds. You're going to have more protein to protein interactions that are going to happen, and gelation will occur. And as I said, protein source is something that you need to think about on impacting feed quality. And so this is just a scanning electron microscopy of a cross section of pellets. And so you can see that the picture on the left, that is a pellet that was made from fish meal. And then the picture on the right is a pellet that was made from defatted toasted soybean meal. And what you'll notice is that the porosity is increased in with that fish meal type protein source, and as opposed to the soybean meal. And so you see ultimately durability is going to be decreased with feeding or having a fish meal type protein source. So that's something that's going to be extra processing that's occurred to that. So similar to like a meat and bone meal, for instance, that's not going to, or a poultry meal, that's not going to necessarily increase your durability. But increasing in the way of soybean meal can improve your durability. Another thing that's important to consider is dietary and supplemental fat. And I told you, I teach feed manufacturing course and your pellet together. And in actuality, fat is terrible for pellet quality, supplemental fat. But it's needed. We need fat for essential amino acids, and also to really be able to meet the modern birds' requirements and optimize their performance, because they have this need for higher energy. In the feed mill, it's going to control dust. It's going to be good for production rate and reduce your power consumption. But you have to be very, very careful depending on your ingredients and what's going into the feed. If you don't have a little bit of supplemental fat, it also depends on your conditioning temperature and your dye specifications and other things. But you have to be careful that you could be denaturing, one, the enzymes that you put in there to get more value out of your feed, but also reducing digestibility of certain amino acids. And that depends on the diet. There are a lot of parameters that are involved around that, but I have some citations sorted that are provided there for that. In terms of pellet quality, like I said, it's not good for pellet quality. There are hydrophobic properties associated with fat. And so it's going to interfere with all the things that we want to happen to cause a good quality pellet. It's going to interfere with binding properties and allow for less frictional force to hold that feed together. And so resulting feed is going to have an increased level of fines if you have increased mixer added fat. So like I had said, there are a multitude of factors that we've been talking about that can impact the feed, and they can all interact. I think that they're all equally important, and they can all interact and impact feed form, but also feed form, but also nutrient availability. And then ultimately that causes some result in bird performance, right? An impact on bird performance. So we've talked about all these different things that are going on, and it's so complex. And so this also, by the way, it increases the cost, right? You're looking at all of these extra motors and this extra equipment and investment to make a pellet. And we just discussed, and I just scratched the surface on how different ingredients can react within the feed mill and impact pellet quality and nutrient availability. So why do we go through this extra cost? And it's because of the benefits that are well established in the literature, even now in modern broilers, and I'll get into a little bit of that data in a few minutes. But some of the benefits associated with feeding pelleted feed include that decrease in prehension time and energy. So the less energy to pick up that pellet for the bird, decrease in feed wastage, as well as a decrease in ingredient segregation and decreasing pathogens within the feed. So that hygienic quality. And that's an area that is really becoming more and more of a hot topic in how to improve the hygienic quality of feed. And even then making that consideration to see how then nutrients can be impacted when having some of these extra processes on the feed. But resulting things that will also occur when feeding pelleted diets, you'll have an increase in feed intake, which ultimately results in live weight gain, increases in carcass weight, and ultimately economic return. And then, so what we're looking at is improving pellet quality to improve the bird's performance. And pellet quality can really just be defined as the durability of that pellet to maintain its structural integrity as it's being transported throughout the feed, being manufactured in the feed mill, and then being transported into the feed, into the feed bin, and then augered throughout the house and at point of bird consumption. And so there's the perception of what feed should look like, right? And one area that I'm right now, our lab is really into is in starter feed quality. And a lot of people have perceptions about what that should look like. And I think that we need to start changing our perceptions, and I'll share a little bit of that data. But there's also the economics, right? A lot of these commercial mills, they're pushed to maximum capacity. And so they're just trying to keep feed in front of the birds. And a lot of techniques that are often utilized to improve feed quality can also be harmful to throughput and some of the costs associated with feed manufacture. And so I think that it takes a really close look at each step of the process and to see if the costs are worth it in the long run. Because feed costs could be increased at the mill, for instance, but for the portion of the total feed costs that go into that bird, the feed costs alone are smaller, much smaller, a fraction than what the actual feed ingredient costs are. So those pelleting and feed manufacturing costs are going to be less. And so if you look at it on an overall picture of what your live costs are per chick whenever you process that bird, investment in feed quality could very well be worth it. And so I wanted to go over some recent, it's a little older, I guess now, but this was one of the first studies that we did just looking at incremental pellet quality differences. And this was something I did in grad school, but we were looking at 0, 30, 60, and 90% pellets and feeding Hubbard by Cobb 500 crosses more in that finisher phase of that small bird. We found improvements in feed quality and feed conversion ratio by 3 to 4 points. And ultimately feeding 90% pellets increased carcass weight by 9 grams. We also established a linear model that with each 10 percentage points increase in percent pellets, that we saw improvements in FCR of 0.4 points and improvements in carcass weight and breast weight by 10 and 4 grams respectively. One criticism that we got of this research was that we're really kind of pushing this 90% pellets, and that's probably often not attainable in a commercial mill. And so what does it really mean? So does it really matter? And what does it matter if we have, what would it mean? What would be the return or the impact if we could have just some small improvements in feed quality, and would it ultimately be a good investment? So several projects have looked at some of these more modest improvements in feed quality. So looking at 40 versus 70% pellets, finding a 2-point improvement in feed conversion ratio, as well as 102 gram improvement in body weight. And then again, 50 versus 70% pellets, actually having a much more dramatic effect of seeing a 60% or 6-point improvement in feed conversion ratio when feeding 70% pellets. And then following it up, looking at 50 versus 80% pellets, having again a pretty dramatic response. And this was, the 2 first studies were with Hubbard by Cobb 500 crosses, with this study being actually with Cobb and Ross 708 birds, and finding on average an 8-point improvement in feed conversion ratio and 80 gram improvement in body weight. And then looking at 55 versus 75% pellets, we see with Ross 708 broilers a little bit less of a dramatic improvement in feed conversion ratio, but still yet improvements that were observed. In our lab, we kind of wanted to look at the whole phase, because a lot of the research has kind of focused on some specific time points in general, and really looking at the finisher phase, just because you have that increased feed consumption. And so ultimately, perhaps you could see the best, that would be the time point that you could have that decrease in prehension time and energy, and ultimately then improve the efficiency of the bird by feeding those higher quality pellets. But what we wanted to do was just look, okay, could you make an investment in a particular time point or phase in that bird's life, and really focus on feed quality at that point, the physical feed quality, and then maybe you could maybe save on costs later by making poor feed quality in other phases. And so we looked at feeding birds either ground crumbles or crumbles that were around 1800 microns. And then we took the equal parts of birds and then either fed them 50% pellets versus 80% pellets in the grower feed. And then in the finisher phase, we fed all those birds 50 versus 80% pellets too. And we had every single combination of this being fed to birds. So could you, for instance, we fed ground crumbles, and so then those birds could either be fed 50% or 80% pellets. If we choose the 80% pellet birds, then again, they were either fed in the finisher phase 50 or 80% pellets. And so we had every combination in between. And this is a paper that's published in Journal of Applied Poultry Research. But what we found was that it interacted. Starter feed form, depending on the grow out, was really important and could impact the type of bird, and can impact your overall budget and your return on investment. And really, there were interactions between the starter and the grower phase. And in some instances, it seems like providing a more common feed quality throughout may be more advantageous. But that kind of made us look at the starter phase in general, and just thinking about taking those individual phases and focusing focusing in on those and optimizing feed quality within that time point. And so there's been a considerable amount of research that has been done in the starter phase. But one thing that should be noted, and this happens within the all other feed quality research areas also, a lot of times there are variations in feed manufacture methods that are utilized and how the treatments are created, if nutritional quality is impacted or not, how the feed quality is assessed, and what the experimental periods were, and then also the strain or the sex of the bird. But several studies just looking at the starter only are listed here, and then several studies looking at a starter and a carryover effect here. But ultimately, all of these projects demonstrated that increased feed quality did not negatively affect performance. And so that's really something that our lab has focused on. And we've even followed it up with some digestibility data too that I don't have time to share with you all today. But we've done a series of studies looking at trying to optimize feed quality in the starter phase. And the smallest that we've tested has been 1,200 microns. And so I put this table together just to kind of summarize a lot of the data. But this is also, these percentages here kind of demonstrate the breakdown of or distribution of the feed that was fed that made up that average particle size of the feed. So greater than 3 micron or millimeters, 3,000 microns, greater than 2 to 3,000 microns, 1 to 2 microns, 1,000 microns, and then less than 1,000 microns. But the smallest feed consumed that we found was, or the smallest tested was 1,200 microns. When we looked at actually what birds were consuming and even preferring in some of the studies, it was 1,600 was the smallest particle size that they consumed. And the largest particle size it really kind of varied, and the preference varied depending on the day frame. So 0 to 6 days and 0 to 14 days, the largest consumed was 2,800 microns for these studies. But then we had another study that we looked from 0 to 18 days, and the largest particle size consumed was 3,200 microns. And ultimately, the largest particle size that we had tested was it was over 3,700 microns. And a great proportion of that diet was actually what would be considered to be a pellet in general. And this was all in the starter phase. And following up, we did some research too that just looked at looking at some relationships between particle size consumed and improved crop fill at the starter phase, as well as body weight, feed conversion ratio, and body weight gain. And we also did some work looking at beak size and feed particle size selection. And we found no correlation there as well. And we had no differences in carryover performance that harmed performance when feeding these larger feed particle sizes in the starter phase. And in many cases, we found improvements. And so ultimately, what I kind of want you to take home today is that the relationship between nutrition and feed manufacture is very complex. And it's not just putting the feed together and making sure that the feed is formulated to be 100% to the specs that you're wanting. It has to be executed along the way. And you have to take into consideration the various ingredients that are going to be in that diet, because ingredients can also, an ingredient list can also indicate the ease of pelleting and also what concerns that you may have from a nutritional standpoint or from a feed manufacturer standpoint. And ultimately, modern meat bird genetics they respond to improved physical feed quality. And the literature supports dramatic and modest feed quality improvements. It supports feeding larger feed particle sizes in the starter phase. And I think we need to start looking more into some of the microstructure of the pellet also. And I know Dr. Pacheco and other labs are doing some work in that area, and I think that's really important in trying to understand more on what's happening nutritionally when we're manufacturing these feeds in different ways. And again, hygiene is going to be another factor that we're going to need to be looking at further and further as well. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attendance and leaving you with the picture again of my great group of students. And I'm sorry to those of you that are my students out there that may not be represented in this picture, but we'll get you next time on the trip. But we do a lot of work in the lab, and it's a lot of hard work, and often very, very manual. And so I really appreciate that I have such a great group with me. And with that, I can take any questions that you may have.
Thank you for that nice presentation, Kelly. We got some questions here, and the first question is, when we have to mix with some liquid ingredients, do we need to increase mixing time?
So I think with that, you have to be careful. You have to just think about how much of the ingredients that or what the quantity is of the mix of the liquid that you're adding. But you do definitely need to think about a dry mix and then a wet mix again. If you just dumped think about making a cake, right? And you're mixing in those ingredients, and you put in those dry ingredients first and get a good blend of all of those. And then, mixing in with the liquids and making sure that you have a proper mix, and even some of those, smaller ingredients. But that's going to vary the mix time just depending on the operation.
Excellent. And the next question is, with your expertise, how do you see the feed industry working with farmers and nutritionists to translate feed science into on-farm feeding programs? What do you think that are the major challenges?
Oh, wow. That's a can of worms. I think that's a hard question. But a great question. I think that everyone appreciates everyone's role, right? And I think that we can all get stuck in our silos, and sometimes it's just it's hard to kind of look into some of these other fields. But I think that people in general, whenever I'm working with people in the industry, they're talking to their folks in the mill, and then their feed manufacturer experts and nutritionists. They're having that conversation. Hey, I know you just bought this load of ingredients that's on sale and you got really cheap, but it's really hard to handle in the feed mill. And this is what's going on. I think communication can always be improved, but I think we're still learning a lot about what's going on in the feed manufacturer and nutrition realm also. So.
Yeah, and like you're saying, communication is extremely important, right?
Yeah.
So the third question is, how do factors like climate change and resource limitation drive the need for innovation at the intersection of feed technology and animal nutrition?
That's another great question. Obviously looking at alternative ingredients that can replace some of these ingredients that we've been using for so long. And so, something that can replace corn and soybean meal, right? That's what everyone's been talking about. But even just, algae is something that's gotten a lot of attention. So then there's a lot of factors that have to be tested within just thinking about algae itself. What is it going to be providing? What is the quantity that's going to be provided? And that's just one example. And then how reliable is that source, the nutritional profile going to be? And is it going to be able to feed are going to be able to be provided at a rate that a large integrator is going to need it to be done. And then how is it going to handle whenever it's being, and when it's in a conveyor, it's in an elevator, it's in a bin, it's going to be augured, it's going to be mixed in the feed. So how's it going to act within that time period? And then also just thinking about the ingredients that we have now too, with corn crops and mycotoxins being more and more of a concern. And then just thinking about how we can utilize the ingredients that we can get and get the most value out of them. And so I think, again, that's going to be innovation that's going to be needed, but that also means a lot of communication in a lot of different fields that maybe wouldn't necessarily normally be communicating.
Yeah, and the other questions that I have here is, what would you say are some of the latest innovations in feed manufacturing technology, and how far do you think we can go in that direction?
I think, and Wilmer, I'd be interested to hear your opinion on this too, because I would say that, the principles of feed manufacture are probably not going to change very much. I think that depending on what the consumers are wanting, that may push, us to be doing different things in the feed mill, like looking at feed hygiene more, for instance. And so then that technology is going to be, that there's technology that exists now that can help control that, but using on a much broader scale or wider scale in more operations, then that's going to impact a lot of the things that people do and the cost of the feed. But, more rapid analyses, being able to monitor, certain things, inline NIRs, those types of technology that help, even just being able to monitor moisture a lot more consistently, so that you can then maybe make some adjustments while you're pelleting feed so that you don't plug the dye. So there's a lot of different things that I think are going on and can, continue to go in that direction too. What would you say, Wilmer?
I completely agree with all what you said. Like you were mentioning NIR, and like some companies are using NIR to evaluate particle size. So in the future, I imagine an NIR measuring the particle size of the ground corn and telling the VFD in the computer if it needs to move faster or slower to reach like an optimal particle size or inline NIRs, as you're mentioning. I agree with all what you say, Kelly. And I have one question this is mine. I would like to know more, like, how do you think like companies can find a balance between, feed quality or feed form? We know that if we improve pellet quality, we can improve performance, but sometimes that will increase the cost of production, right? How do you think that companies can find that balance between, manufacturing and animal performance and nutrient digestibility?
Yeah, that's $1 million question, I think. But I think that is really just it's gonna come up to communication, because and I know that a lot of companies, they're really driven by looking at that little blue book and how other companies are performing in different areas, and breaking down each step of production and what the costs are associated with it. And it may be worth looking at things on a more, global or overall big picture, and ultimately what happens to the live costs at the end, and maybe not what happens to, manufacturer costs versus feed costs. Because if you split out those feed costs and manufacturing costs, it's a lot less of that percentage of the total grow out that makes up to produce that bird. And so it's a lot smaller than what you may think. And so it may be worth that investment, but you might have to sacrifice being at the top of the board in that blue book.
That's true. Yeah. And we don't have any other questions, Kelly, so I would just like to thank you for participating in this webinar. It's always nice listening to your presentations.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for joining.
Take care. Have a nice day.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.